If you would, open up to Genesis chapter 14. Genesis chapter 14. If you remember last week in Genesis 13, in talking about Abram's a very rich man, very wealthy, and yet the wealth, the possessions have become so great that he and his nephew Lot can no longer live together in the same place. The herdsmen are even fighting, and yet you see from Abram this earnest desire for peace, to the point where he's willing to say to Lot, you just pick which direction you want to go. If you go left, I'll go right. If you go right, I'll go left. Either way, maybe I said that wrong, but to put that together and go, he gave Lot that ability. And you realize, because of these attitudes, once again at the end of chapter 13, the Lord tells Abram, I am going to give this land to your descendants. And at this point in time, there are no descendants for Abram and for his wife. Then you come to Genesis chapter 14, and notice how this begins. Look at these first couple of verses. And it came about in the days of Amraphel, king of Shinar, Arioch, king of Eleazar, and Chedorlaomer, king of Elam, and Tidal, king of Goam, that they made war with Bera, king of Sodom, and with Birsha, king of Gomorrah, Shinab, king of Admah, and Shemeber, king of Zeboim, and the king of Bela, that is Zoar. Now, you look through here and you realize there's a war that's brewing, and it's going to give you the backstory here in a minute, but going 4 kings versus 5. And typically, if you think in terms of numbers, you would expect that the 5 kings are the ones who are going to whoop up on them, and then this will all be said and done. But that is not the way this is going to go until the end. Here, once again, if you notice, it says Amraphel, king of Shinar. Where do you remember Shinar from? If you remember the Tower of Babel, of course, it took place in the plain of Shinar. And so realize you're ways off, almost into the land of Babylon. So these kings come from a long ways off, away from Canaan. And then in terms of Chedorlaomer, which I've always wondered, ladies who are with child, going, you're looking for a perfect name. I mean, Chedorlaomer, I've never met one in my life. But once again, they're probably called Chedorlaomer by his friends, so be careful. Then in verse 2, he says, it mentions these other kings about the king of Sodom, the king of Gomorrah, the king of Admah, the king of Zeboim, and the king of Bela. He says, and that is Zoar. Zoar is another name for Bela. And ironically, it doesn't even tell you the king of Bela's name through all of this story. There's a little bit of foreshadowing in that. But there's something else I want you to already know. You notice this, and I've mentioned this before, and I think it'd be a good time to just read it. Look over at Deuteronomy chapter 29. So you get a feel for the spiritual side of these kings. Deuteronomy 29, look down at verse 22. Deuteronomy 29, verse 22. It says, now the generation to come, your sons who rise up after you, and the foreigner who comes from a distant land, when they see the plagues of the land and the diseases which the Lord has afflicted it, and notice the Lord is in all caps, covenant God. You don't honor him, there is a cursing. Now, he says, overthrew him, and notice, which the Lord has afflicted it, will say, verse 23, all its land is brimstone and salt, a burning waste, unsown and unproductive, and no grass grows in it. How big has the judgment been? Devastating. I think that's the right way to say it. Devastating. I mean, the land is filled with salt. You ever tried to grow anything on land that has too much salt? You won't grow anything. Then he says brimstone. You think about burning sulfur. He says a burning waste. He says you don't sow any seeds there, and if you did, it wouldn't be productive anyway. Then he says there's not even any grass that grows there. But notice this next part. He says, like the overthrow of Sodom and Gomorrah, Admah and Zeboim, which the Lord overthrew in his anger and in his wrath. I'm sure you're pretty aware of Sodom and Gomorrah. But so often we forget about these other two cities that are mentioned alongside of them in terms of Admah and Zeboim. And to go, the Lord overthrew all of them, all four of them. Sodom, Gomorrah, Admah, Zeboim. He says, once again, covenant God. He says, in his anger and in his wrath. And whenever he destroys in his anger and in his wrath, how does it turn out? Complete and not good for the recipient, right? Now, come back over to Genesis chapter 14. I tell you that just to make sure so that whenever you're seeing these kings, and notice they are the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah, Admah and Zeboim, which tells you the kind of people that are being dealt with here. They're all people who are going to be overthrown in a mighty way down the line. Now, you know about the foreshadowing, what's coming in Genesis chapter 19 with Sodom and Gomorrah. But realize, here's what's going on in these times, and you're really not too far away from it in timeline-wise. Really, probably just within 10 to 20 years at the most. Could be a little bit closer. So here they are. Now, Genesis 14, look at verse 3. He says, all these came as allies to the valley of Siddim, that is the Salt Sea. And you can probably imagine in your mind where the Salt Sea is, and go, all of these 9 kings at one point in time had an alliance together. And to go, you imagine, here they all are, the 5 in particular that are one side are all around the Salt Sea or the Dead Sea. And the other 4 really are kind of more toward a northern aspect of the land of Canaan. But here they are, then, verse 4. You notice they had this alliance for 12 years. And it seems like you can only have peace with people for so long, and then something's going to come in. Verse 4. 12 years they had served Kedorlaomer, but the 13th year they rebelled. For 12 years, everything worked out well. The 13th year, these 5 kings of Sodom, Gomorrah, Admah, Zeboim, and the king of Bela, which is Zoar. And you're going to read about Zoar again whenever we get over to chapter 19. And you're going to see it's not taken down with these other 4. It's kind of a unique little story. We'll save that for over there. So, 12 years, they served Kedorlaomer, who seems to kind of be the figurehead of this group. He says, 13th year they rebelled, so what do you expect to happen in the 14th year? Time for war and battle. And verse 5. In the 14th year, Kedorlaomer and the kings that were with him came and defeated the Rephaim in Asheroth Karnaim, and the Zuzim in Ham, and the Emim in Shaveh Kiriathaim. I'm sure you're thinking, I know exactly where all those places are. Now, I'll kind of give you a general idea as we go through. I had a map, but it's kind of in a vertical format, so it really wouldn't show up well. I tried it. It probably wasn't worth our time. But here's kind of the thought. All of a sudden, Kedorlaomer and these other 3 kings start to work their way down from where you can kind of imagine, if you're looking at the land of Palestine, up in the northeast, like along where Babylon comes from, the land of Shinar, you think about those things, of working their way down, and they come through on the east side of the Jordan Valley, Sea of Galilee, all the way down to the Dead Sea. They work their way down, and they just start destroying places. I mean, they just hammer them, one after another. And that's why he brings up these places. It says, defeated the Rephaim. Later on down the line, whenever the children of Israel are coming out of the wilderness, on the east side of the Jordan River, before they cross Jericho, they destroy the kings of Og and Sidon. And to realize that Og is one of the last descendants of the Rephaim. So you're seeing, and that's about a 500-year span. But at the same time, realize whenever they're coming through, they're not utterly destroying everybody, but they are certainly taking everybody down to the very foundation of what civilization they have. Then he says, he mentions these towns by name, Zuzim and Ham, and you think about, these are all descendants of Ham, if you go back far enough. Then he says, an Emim in Shaveh Kiriathaim. Then verse 6. He says, in the Horites in their Mount Seir as far as El Paran, which is by the wilderness. now they've come, it's almost like they went all the way around the east side of the Jordan River, down south of the Dead Sea, and then they're going to work their way underneath down to the Negev, and then now they're going to start to work their way up north through the land of Canaan. I mean, this is quite a battle they're working their way through. So these four kings that are together are just working their way down the east side of the Jordan River on the land, and then they come around the bottom, and now they're starting to come at the bottom and work their way up from there. So they're just taking them one after another. Then it describes a little bit more here, verse 7. Then they turned back, and that means they're going to start heading north, and came to En-Mishpat, that is Kadesh, and conquered all the country of the Amalekites and also the Amorites who lived at Hazazon Tamar. Now they're starting to work their way back up along the west side of the Dead Sea, which means they're getting closer to where these other kings are really established in. So they work their way through. Notice verse 8. It says, and the king of Sodom and the king of Gomorrah and the king of Admah and the king of Zeboim and the king of Bela, that is Zoar. Notice how it keeps on telling you that? You're going to need that information later. He says, came out, and they arrayed for battle against them in the valley of Sidom. Now, the valley of Sidom is actually just south of the Dead Sea. So they finally get to this place where it's time for battle to take place. And they all get garbed up in their battle array, and it's time for this gauntlet to be thrown down. Then, as he continues on, he says, verse 9, against Chedorlaomer, king of Elam, Tidal, king of Goim, and Amraphel, king of Shinar, and Arioch, king of Elasar, 4 kings against 5. And you go, here they are. And I mean, like, this is like a battle for the ages in one sense, at least for the time. And so here they are, the standoff is ready to go, and then notice what happens. Verse 10. Now the valley of Siddim was full of tar pits, and the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah fled, and they fell into them, but those who survived fled to the hill country. Why in the world would you choose a place that's full of tar pits to have this great big old battle? At the same time, what would you expect to happen if you have a battle around all these tar pits? People are going to sink. People are going to get stuck. I mean, if you start kind of working your way and thinking about tar pits in general, I mean, big, massive animals can get stuck in tar pits, and then all of a sudden it turns around to where they can't get out, and it's kind of a unique little setting because then all of a sudden the predatory animals go, well, man, that's a big piece of meat just sitting there. And then all of a sudden a predatory animal comes in, they jump on the back and they start eating, and then they slip off and get in the tar pit and go, you're right here with us now, huh? That's just kind of naturally speaking. But going for them, here they are, but I want you to notice something about the king of Sodom and Gomorrah. What do they do specifically? They run. Now, which tells you, are they brave kings? They're like, we're out of here. And sure enough, they do. And notice it says at the end of verse 10, but those who survived fled to the hill country. And the king of Sodom is going to be a survivor, by the way. But they fled to the hill countries, means they went west, closer to where Salem is. Then, as it continues on here, verse 11, then they took all the goods of Sodom and Gomorrah and all their food supply and departed. Who's they? The 4 kings, Chedorlaomer, and you think in terms of Arioch, Amraphel, and Tidal. So here they are all together, and notice they strip everything down. They go through and they take it all. They don't leave anything behind. And specifically it points out, they took all their food supply and departed. They took all the goods of Sodom and Gomorrah. Well, what happens if somebody was to take all your food tonight? Is that going to affect your life? Especially if you can't go to the store and just buy some more? So this is a big turn, like life and death kind of stuff. Now, the next time you start to read about some of these people, they're going to be way off in the north. But what he brings out next is where we get back to Abram. Verse 12. They also took Lot, Abram's nephew, and his possessions and departed, for he was living in Sodom. So notice now Lot also gets taken. This is not just goods and things. You're going to see later, there's a lot of people who are taken in this too. Whether they're taken on as slaves or captives in whatever way. And they took all of Lot's possessions as well. If you remember, what drove Lot to be down to Sodom to begin with? Too many possessions. I mean, he had so much, and yet there wasn't enough land to take care of everything. And at the same time, he gets down here because this is where the best ground is. It was like the garden of the Lord in Eden. So here they are. And you can just imagine for Lot, I wonder if he ever thought, maybe I made the wrong choice. I don't know, but then he'd also have the next thought of going, but if it wasn't me, who would it be? Abram would have been here. Sometimes following those thoughts doesn't always take you to a place that goes, oh, that would have been great. So, here's the situation, verse 13. Then a fugitive came and told Abram the Hebrew. Now he was living by the oaks of Mamre the Amorite, brother of Eshcol and brother of Aner, and these were allies with Abram. You notice the title that it gives to Abram here? It calls him the Hebrew. I mean, it doesn't call him a Hebrew, it calls him the Hebrew. Now, this is kind of unique because here we are in Genesis 14. You're not going to read about somebody else called the Hebrew until you get to Genesis 39. And you know who the Hebrew is going to be? Joseph. Joseph's going to be the next Hebrew that gets mentioned that way. And so you realize there's kind of a line here as it goes. And it shouldn't be any surprise to us. In the book of Hebrews in the New Testament, Abraham's mentioned 10 times. Joseph's mentioned twice just in Hebrews chapter 11. And to go, there's a tie to what's going on back here, but we'll deal with that maybe another day. Then he says, he told Abram the Hebrew, and notice, Abram also has some allies. And it talks about him specifically about being brothers. He says, remember he was living by the oaks of Mamre. Well, Mamre's actually a man. And he's got two other brothers, Eshcol as well as Aner. So here they are, his allies. I want you to realize how tied to him they are. They had just seen 4 kings come down and sweep through and destroy the lands of 5 kings. And now you have Abram and 3 brothers, and look at what they do in verse 14. When Abram heard that his relative had been taken captive, he led out his trained men born in his house, 318, and went in pursuit as far as Dan. You imagine, you've just seen lands destroyed time and time and time and time again. And Abram gets word, it says, just from a captive who apparently had run for his life in some way, finds out the situation, and Abram doesn't have 3 kings that he's allied with. He just talks about 3 men who are brothers. And they gather up 318 men and go, we're going to go. What in the world would ever make them think this is a great idea? Do you remember what God promised Abram? Look back at Genesis 12 and look at verse 3. Here's the covenant that God made with Abram. And I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you, I will curse. Is Abram trusting this promise? Is this like, oh, this is easy to see how God's going to do this? No, not at all. Can you see the faith going on in Abram here? Now, I mean, here's a group of 4 kings who have swept down one side of the Jordan, come around the bottom to the south, and starting to work their way up north. And I want you to notice how far the pursuit takes them all the way up to Dan. I used to have a funny professor, and he used to talk about if somebody tore their pants from Dan to Beersheba, they tore them from the top to the bottom. Because Dan is just as far north as you can get in the land of Canaan. And so Dan is all the way far north. So this collective group of alliance of these four kings have basically made a U all the way down from the north on the east side, come around the bottom of the Dead Sea, have just whipped up on everybody along the way, and now they're headed back up to the north. And they've gotten all the way back up to Dan. And you just kind of think, they're getting kind of towards the end of this trek, like, well, we've about cleaned house here in this land. We got all these goods, all these possessions, livestock to go with it if they took everything that Lot had. Then, verse 15, he, talking about Abram, divided his forces against them by night. Oh, we have 318, so what's the best next idea? Let's split us up, we're just too big. Right? But he divides them up, and then when does he hit them? At night. Element of surprise is not new. Then he says, he and his servants, and defeated them and pursued them as far as Hobah, which is north of Damascus. They don't just stop at Dan and go, that's good enough. They go, we're going to chase them back home. And they take off even further north. I mean, notice the lands they're getting to. It says they're north of Damascus. You're off into Syria. I mean, this is way up there. They're not even in Canaan land anymore. So, they're up there, the north of Damascus, verse 16. He brought back all the goods and also brought back his relative Lot with his possessions and also the women and the people. So notice, there were a lot of people who were taken captive. And now, because of Abram responding to God's promise and going, God, you said, you'll curse the ones I curse and you'll bless the ones I bless. He took him at his word. Take 318 fighting men and these three brothers and Abram and go, we're going to go take on four kings who have just whipped up on everything through this land. Isn't that faith? If you ever think numbers really matter when it comes to God's promises, pay attention to Genesis 14. Because all you really need to see is God going to keep his promises? Yeah. Now, notice once again, now you kind of get to the aftermath. Look down at verse 17. So, then after his return from the defeat of Chedorlaomer and the kings who were with him, the king of Sodom went out to meet him, talk about meeting Abram, at the valley of Sheva, that is the king's valley. Notice all of a sudden the king of Sodom is still around. So he was among those who fled and is still there. And of course, verse 18, somebody new shows up. And Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. Now he was a priest of God Most High. Melchizedek shows up and it says he's the king of Salem. Now, if you're a note taker, just write down Psalm 76, verse 2, and you'll see the tie that's there. Salem is tied to Mount Zion and also tied to right there around Jerusalem. Or Salem, of course, is the Hebrew word. Typically people say it if you're a Jew. You say shalom, peace. So Melchizedek is the king of peace. And of course, where he dwells is right there where a future location will be of Jerusalem. He says, and he brings out bread and wine, and it specifically points out that he was a priest of God Most High. Just in the title, what do you learn? You going to find anybody any higher? Nope. And he's a priest. So, of God Most High. Verse 19. Says, he blessed them and said, blessed be Abram of God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth. And blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand. He gave him a tenth of all. Melchizedek offers a blessing to Abram. And he says, blessed be Abram because of his tie to who? God Most High. Who is Melchizedek tied to? God Most High. Melchizedek and Abram share something. They're both tied together with the God Most High. Melchizedek being the priest, Abram being the recipient of these covenant promises. And he says, blessed be Abram of God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth, because God controls it all. Then in verse 20, what should that bring about? He says, and blessed be God Most High, because he's the one who has delivered your enemies into your hand. Who is this priest? What's he recalling? Didn't God make a promise? And sure enough, hasn't God kept his promise? I want you to think about this, even in your own life. Whenever you know you couldn't have done it on your own and you see how God does something, he keeps a promise, what should it drive us toward? Are we going to bless God? Are we going to speak good words about him? What does that really tie around? Is there going to be a worship toward God because he keeps his promises? How easy is it to go day to day to day and not really think about that God has kept his promises? New Testament-wise, Matthew chapter 6, Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount says, seek first his kingdom and his righteousness. What's he going to take care of? All these things will be added to you. He'll take care of you physically. Anybody in here eat at least one meal today? Anybody blessed enough to have two? Anybody get three? A few snacks in between? Do we think in terms of blessing God for what he provides? I notice everybody's got clothes on tonight. I'm thankful. You probably have a place to lay your head tonight, don't you? Do you bless God for those things? Has he not kept his promises? Yet how easy is it to just go from day to day and go, I'm taking care, oh yeah. And forget who the source of these things is? Now, I want you to notice the next aspect in verse 20. It says, he gave him a tenth of all. Now, don't you love it when you get a bunch of pronouns and you're not quite sure who it ties to? It almost sounds like my children talking. But at the same time, for clarity, you can just kind of jot down Hebrews chapter 7, verse 4, because it fills in the pronouns for us. That Abram gave Melchizedek a tenth of all. Now, here's the destruction of these four kings in terms of what they had possession-wise, the people they had taken captive. They had swept through everything, through the whole land of Canaan almost. And now here's all these possessions, and Abram, because of how he wants to bless God, after hearing what Melchizedek has to say in blessing, it draws up within him to say, I want to give God a tenth of everything. You think a tenth of everything that was in the land of Canaan? That these four kings went through and destroyed? Now, you go, that's quite an offering, right? Then, verse 21, this almost sounds funny to me. You imagine seeing kings watch warriors just start to give away possessions. And you know the fate of the king of Sodom. The king of Sodom said to Abram, king of Sodom, the same one that fled for the hills. I wonder if he had tar on his feet whenever he fled. He says, the king of Sodom said to Abram, give the people to me and take the goods for yourself. What does he want? Give me the people. I want the slaves. I want the citizens. These are all people who were living in the land of Canaan. He says, just give me the people. Now, king of Sodom, what did you do to make this all happen? Run. You ran. And now you want to be the one who's going to mediate the deal? Doesn't that sound funny to you? It sounds just like kind of things you might expect today. He says, give the people to me and take the goods for yourself. He says, you can have the goods. Take all the possessions. Take the livestock, whatever. But I want you to notice Abram's response to this. And I want you to notice why he does it. Verse 22. Abram said to the king of Sodom, and his name is Bera. He said to Bera, I have sworn to the Lord, all caps, God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth. He says, I've already sworn to the God of covenant. Well, what'd you tell him? Verse 23. That I will not take a thread or a sandal thong or anything that is yours, for fear you would say, I have made Abram rich. He says, I'm not going to take a thread of clothing. He says, even a little old thin leather strap that goes on a sandal. He says, I'm not even going to take that from you. And why will he not do it? I don't want you to be so proud and arrogant that you think that you're the one who made me rich. Now, you think about how many possessions there were there. I mean, you think if you just swept through a county in Missouri and took all the possessions, I'll just let you guess at how much it'd be worth. And I won't take anything from you. Because I want you to know everything I have didn't come from you. In passing, what's he saying? Who did it come from? From God. Now, he says, you might say, I've made Abram rich. Verse 24. Then we'll make an application. I will take nothing except what the young men have eaten. Isn't that a funny thing? As if he might want that back. He says, and the share of the men who went with me. And he mentions 3 men by name. And they're these brothers. Aner, Eshcol, and Mamre. Let them take their share. He says, you let them have what they want. Let the men keep what they've eaten already. The rest is yours. Now, I want you to think of a present-day application. I'll get you started, and then you tell me how it would finish if you're going to think like Abram. You ever heard of the Publishers Clearinghouse? As a kid, I was enamored with it because it wasn't gambling because you didn't have to buy anything. And I thought, maybe someday somebody's going to show up at my front door with all these balloons and a big check, and man, everything's going to be great. I'd even fill out forms. Free. I don't know if Dad knew I took the stamps or not. But in going through it, if the Publishers Clearinghouse was to show up on your front door with all the balloons, the big check, let's just say for whatever big number you want to put in your head, and they said, you have won the Publishers Clearinghouse. If you were Abram, what would you say? Think about it. If you use Abram's mindset, what would you say? I don't need it. I have the promises of the faithful God. You can take that to my neighbors. Is that the way we think about physical things? Here's Abram. He says, I don't want anybody to think that this came because of you. I want you to know it came because of the Lord. Now, if you really strive to look here, it takes it to a really another level. Because then you start looking through, thinking about in terms of the New Testament. Melchizedek is only mentioned twice in the Old Testament. Yet in the New Testament, he's mentioned 8 times. In Hebrews chapters 5, 6, and 7. And the plan is for next week, we're going to kind of take just a little bit of a break from Genesis, and we're going to look at Melchizedek, because he is worth looking at to really see what's going on here in Genesis chapter 14 a step further. Because Melchizedek is going to be equated with Jesus, high priest of the Most High God, and to see the parallels that are there. But real quickly, I want you to look over at the New Testament. Look at Luke chapter 11. Luke chapter 11, look at verses 27 and 28. Remember, Melchizedek gave a blessing to Abram. And for us, it's really not a matter of whether Melchizedek will bless us, but really the question is Jesus going to bless us? Because that is what's going to make all the difference in the world. Luke chapter 11, look at verse 27. While Jesus was saying these things, one of the women in the crowd raised her voice and said to him, "Blessed is the womb that bore you and the breasts at which you nursed." What's he really saying? Blessed is your mother. As if to say, blessed is Mary. Notice verse 28, how it starts. But he said, on the contrary. Whoa. He doesn't say, blessed is Mary. A lot of people want to really put Mary on a high pedestal. He says, on the contrary. He says, blessed are those who hear the word of God and obey it or observe it. He says, there's how you find a blessing from Jesus. You hear the word of God and you observe it and do it. And there will be a blessing. And it's the idea, the blessing goes as long as you're willing to hear the word of God and to observe it or obey it. Look at Luke chapter 12. Look down at verse 35. Jesus is just talking about what's been treasured in the heart. He says, what's there? He says, where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. What if you treasure the Word of God? Where's your heart going to be? You'll be right there with Him because you'll observe what He says to do. But verse 35, be dressed in readiness and keep your lamps lit. Be like men who are waiting for their master when he returns from the wedding feast, so that they may immediately open the door to him when he comes and knocks. How ready are these servants? Does it matter if they have to light the lamps? Does it matter if they have to stay up late? Does it matter if they have to keep things ready even when it doesn't seem like anybody may show up in time? He says, they're ready. They're going to be observant. Verse 37, blessed are those slaves whom the master will find on the alert when he comes. Truly I say to you that he will gird himself to serve and have them recline at the table and will come up and wait on them. Now you think about that. This is just awesome. He says, whenever you're going to be ready, in other words, we're going to honor the words of God no matter duration, no matter difficulty, no matter hardship. We're going to be ready because we're going to hear the Word of God and we're going to observe it. He says, even when it gets dark, even when it takes effort, even when it takes toil, he says, those are the ones that are going to be blessed, those slaves. And do you see the payoff of the blessing? When the master comes and finds them ready, what's the master going to do? He's going to say, you sit down. I'm going to serve you now. What does that tell you about the heart of this master? What's in his heart? Is it not a heart to serve? Here are people who have served him. Now you see him turn around and be ready to serve. This is quite a picture. If this ties to us, who's the one who's going to serve us? It's a really odd answer, isn't it? It says, here's the blessing. Because in this life, who's taking care of us? He is. Jesus is. And then real quickly, he says, and have them recline at the table and will come up and wait on them, whether he comes in the second watch or even in the third, and finds them so, blessed are those slaves. What do you find encouragement for? Don't ever stop. Don't ever give up. Be ready no matter what effort and hardship it takes, because this blessing is worth more than all the physical stuff put together. It pales in comparison. All right. Next week we'll plan on coming back and talking a little bit more about Melchizedek and really seeing Jesus in that.